everyone. Excited to be here to talk to all of you about the role of data in political campaigns. As Pete mentioned, this is probably going to be pretty different from a lot of the other conversations happening over the next 2 days. But fundamentally, the work that I do and my team at the DNC does is centered around delivering data as a product to Democratic campaigns around the country. And so I'm really excited to talk to this group about the role that data plays in political campaign strategy and how that role has changed over time. I want to ground this conversation in a little bit of background about what political campaigns are fundamentally trying to do, because that drives the discussion we have around the data that campaigns need and how they utilize it to effectively reach voters. Fundamentally, the goals of campaigns, pretty straightforward. You're trying to win the most votes, and you're trying to do that in a resource-limited world. So campaigns are attempting to use limited resources to efficiently net enough votes for their candidate to win. That requires doing a few specific things. Investing money in the right places in the context of trying to flip the House of Representatives or win the presidency. Identifying the districts that are most competitive, the states that will get you over the 270 electoral vote margin to win the White House is the critical first point of decision-making made by campaigns and other political organizations. Once you've figured out where to spend money, making sure that you're running cost-effective programs that net votes efficiently is the next big piece of campaigns' jobs. Making sure that the places you're spending money are actually reaching voters and getting them to take the actions you want. And a fundamental part of running cost-effective programs is making sure you're focusing those programs on the right people, on the people that will actually be moved by hearing communication from a political campaign through a specific program. So what does this concretely mean? Who are the people that campaigns need to move, and what are the programs we run to do that? Most simplistically, campaigns are attempting to change the behaviors of voters along a few spectrums. If you assume that people start out with some initial likelihood to support a candidate, a Democrat or a Republican, and some initial likelihood to vote or to not vote, the fundamental thing campaigns are trying to do is either increase somebody's likelihood to support your candidate rather than your opponent, or increase their likelihood to vote when they otherwise wouldn't have, or add new people to the electorate through voter registration programs specifically focused on people that you will be able to turn out and who will ultimately vote for your candidate. So, campaign strategy is fundamentally focused on moving people along those spectrums and moving enough voters in enough ways that you will effectively net enough votes to win. That means starting by asking questions like, who are the people we need to reach? This looks different district to district, whether the thing that will win you a campaign is persuading voters, turning out supporters who don't always vote, or expanding the electorate looks different depending on the state of the race and the place where you're running a campaign. Once defining who the people are you need to reach, campaigns need to understand what are the actions we need those people to take. What does it look like to persuade them to support our candidate, to turn out to vote when they otherwise wouldn't have, or to give money to a campaign, to volunteer their time, to expand the capacity of the campaign, to reach more people towards those goals. Once you know the people you're trying to reach and the things you need those people to do, you can start asking practical questions about the medium, the message, and the messenger that will be most effective at getting those people to take the action you need them to take. All of these things raise a couple of tactical questions against which you can evaluate any program that a campaign seeks to run. We can ask, are the people that we're trying to reach in fact reachable through a given tactic? Campaigns call people, they knock on doors, they send text messages, they try to reach people online. The first question is, are the people we're trying to reach actually available through that mechanism, and do we have the data available to call somebody or to knock on their door? Beyond just understanding the availability of data on a specific person, understanding their receptiveness to a specific mechanism of contact is critical to spending money efficiently. And those questions in combination, knowing where do we actually have the data to reach a person through a specific program, and what are they going to be responsive to, compared with how much time is that going to cost, how much money is it going to cost, provides the fundamental framework for letting campaigns evaluate the programs they run. These are all broad strategic questions, but they're also all fundamentally questions about data. They're questions about the people who actually exist on different places of that spectrum. How do we know people who are likely to support a candidate, or likely to be persuadable, or to be mobilized to turn out? How do we know if we're actually reaching those people and if they're actually changing their behaviors in response to communication from a campaign? But the ways that campaigns have leveraged data in order to accomplish these goals has changed dramatically over the last 20 years. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of political data, specifically in the Democratic Party, as a grounding to talk about where we are today and how we use data to answer these questions. So we're going to go back to the early 2000s. At this point in time, political campaigns attempted to do all the things I just named by identifying groups of voters using either geographic information or demographic information broadly to understand who are the types of people that would be supportive of a given candidate, who are more or less likely to vote, or who are more or less likely to care about certain issues. The kind of data that was available to campaigns included things like historical election results. You can know down to a political precinct, which is the smallest level of geography on which political election results are officially reported. How did people vote in past elections? And what issues do they care about in the context of political polling? They would ask people broadly, who are you going to support? What issues matter to you? And would classify the population into broad categories of groups of people who cared about certain things or would act in certain ways. Campaigns leverage this data in a whole bunch of different ways, but without any sort of connected system. There was no shared record keeping of these election results or this aggregated data, no shared record keeping of how voters were actually responding when campaigns talked to them. And when campaigns went and had conversations with voters, the data they collected lived in totally disparate systems, if it existed at all. After the 2004 election, when Democrats lost the 2004 presidential election, there was a recognition that we were falling behind in terms of collecting and utilizing data about the electorate. So, in the years after the 2004 election, the Democratic Party embarked on a program to actually construct a national voter file. That meant standardizing data about individual voters across all 50 states, and providing that data to campaigns, state parties, and other political entities in a centralized CRM so that all voter contact activity could be tracked in a standardized way. Just to talk a little bit about what the voter file actually is, because this is fundamentally the backbone of what political data is and what the data product is that the Democratic National Committee provides to Democratic campaigns. When you register to vote, you provide certain information to your state. That data is generally publicly available, and there are rules state to state around what data can be provided to whom, but generally, states collect information like your name, your address, which includes information about what elections you're eligible to vote in, and your vote history. In some states, they also collect information like the political party you registered for, your date of birth, your gender, your race, and contact information like phone numbers. These data files look different state to state, both in terms of their content and their structure. Especially at this time, requesting this kind of data from a state would sometimes come digitally, sometimes come in the mail. And there was no standard structure to either what you would get from any state or how it was organized. So the fundamental task of the party during this time was compile this voter data from around the country, standardize it, and provide it in a CRM so that everybody had access. Any campaign running for office, Democrat running for office, had access to the same information, regardless of where they were. That meant that going into the 2008 Obama campaign, the presidential campaign and campaigns up and down the ballot had a complete list of registered voters available to them. Again, with varying levels of actual data available to state, but in a standardized format. That also meant that people were now starting to participate and feed additional data into this shared central CRM. This shows just the growth of adoption of the CRM that's used to track organizing activities. There was scattered use in the early 2000s of the central tool that is now used by Democratic campaigns around the country to enter data into a shared system. By 2008, 50 states were all contributing data from the doors they were knocking, the phone calls they were making, and the other interactions they were having with voters around the country. That laid the groundwork for the significant advancements in political analytics that came in the following years. Some of this was tested in 2008 and 2010, but by the 2012 Obama re-election campaign, there was a team on the ground that was able to harness the data that had been compiled since the advent of the national voter file around 2005, and the data that had been collected through the 2008 and 2010 election cycles. In addition to the data from the states and collected in the field, the Obama campaign collected and appended significant new data on top of the voter file. That included consumer data about people's purchasing habits, socioeconomic traits, and other variables, in addition to ongoing surveys run by the campaign to provide real-time information about how people felt about the candidates in the 2012 race, the issues they cared about, and more. This provided the framework for leveraging advanced analytics to predict voter behavior on an individual level. This shows just the rise of the total amount of data being collected just through organizing programs through 2008 and 2012 that provided the data foundation for making some of these campaign decisions. The 2012 Obama Analytics Program was the foundation of how political analytics are leveraged in campaigns today. So I wanted to spend a minute talking concretely about what that looked like. Folks have probably interacted with predictive models in some contexts, but I want to talk a little bit about how predictive analytics particularly works in campaigns. The Obama campaign, for instance, ran significant surveys to collect data about voter opinions and preferences, primarily collected by making phone calls to a sample of voters taken from the voter file, designed to look like a representative sample of the people who were going to vote in the 2012 election. Ask them direct questions about who they were going to vote for, code those responses, and then build models off of that and all of the other traits that we had about voters in order to provide predictive probabilities about the likely behavior of each voter in the upcoming election. What that means, concretely, is that the campaign was able to take every individual on the voter file, going back to this basic grid of what campaigns are trying to do, identify voters on a scale of supportive to non-supportive, and of likely voters to unlikely voters, and assign a 0 to 1 score to every voter on those two traits. So that, coupled with experimental analysis that campaigns started running around this time, allowed us to identify the pockets of voters that were actually most efficient to talk to. We know, for instance, that the most efficient place to net votes for a candidate is by talking to people who are very likely to support your candidate, have support scores very close to 1, and who have turnout scores in the middle of the range, meaning they're people who vote sometimes but not always, whose behavior is inconsistent, and who are most likely to be affected by a nudge from a campaign to turn out and vote. It's important to note here that the models built in the political context are designed both to predict the behavior of individual people, but also to give us an aggregate idea of how the entire electorate is going to perform. Understanding, with some degree of uncertainty baked in, what is likely to happen on aggregate, how voters across an entire state are going to behave, is also an essential part of the question of spending resources in the right place, by understanding the states that are likely to come down to the thinnest margin, and where the investment of a political program could make the biggest difference. So, this work all happened around the 2012 election. It also necessitated significant investment, not just in new data collection, but also in technology that would make the aggregation and utilization of this data possible. So, leading into the 2012 election, the Obama campaign, in partnership with the DNC, worked to overhaul the technology platform that campaigns were using as a foundation for analytics. Specifically, that meant adopting Vertica, a tool bought by HP around this time, as a data warehouse and analytics platform to store the voter file and to take in all of the data that was coming from field campaigns, from emails being sent to supporters, and from other data sources being generated by the Obama campaign in 2012. In many ways, Vertica was the tool that made it possible for campaigns to run advanced analytics, and for the 2012 campaign especially to harness all of the data that was becoming available from both public records, consumer sources, and campaigns in the field in order to run effective targeted programs. As I mentioned, this work has been the foundation of analytics in campaigns in the 6 or so years since then. But over that time, there have also been significant changes in how campaigns operate and in the scale of data being collected by them. Specifically, cycle over cycle, we've seen a significant rise in the collection of data and in the utilization of advanced analytics, not just by presidential campaigns, but by campaigns up and down the ballot to run more efficiently targeted programs. That means that while both 2008 and 2012 were high watermarks at the time for the amount of voter data being collected, those lines were exceeded in 2016 and again during the 2018 election, just in terms of the volume of data being collected. What this meant, especially in 2018, was that we had a platform around the country that provided candidates up and down the ballot with advanced analytics tools that allowed us to focus resources in the right places. And in many ways, this is part of what drove historic wins around the country in the last year. So in 2018, we saw historic levels of volunteerism for Democratic campaigns around the country, with more than 1.5 million people signing up to volunteer for campaigns and signing up for more than 4 million volunteer activities. That meant also generating an unprecedented level of information from direct contacts with voters. Specifically, campaigns this year attempted more people and knocked on more doors than any presidential cycle or any other cycle on record in this shared database. And reached out to more voters than the last 2 midterm elections, 2010 and 2014 combined. Specifically, campaigns were able to leverage data and analytics to run targeted programs that focused on the districts in the country that were most competitive, including 42 congressional districts around the country that Democrats flipped by investing significantly more resources in than in past midterm elections. Specifically, within only these targeted districts, we saw more than 40 million points of outreach to voters living in these 42 competitive congressional districts, and talked to millions more voters in those districts than in the same districts in 2014. That means we're generating significantly more data, but it's also important to know that the nature of the data being generated is changing as campaign programs change themselves. One of the biggest examples of this, and that is most apparent in the data we have, is the rise of text messaging as a political outreach mechanism. This is peer-to-peer, one-to-one text messaging. It was non-existent as a technology in 2014, made up 0% of all of the outreach from campaigns to voters. A few companies came onto the market in 2015 that facilitated large-scale but one-to-one conversations between volunteers and voters through text messaging. And during the 2016 election, around 6% of all outreach that happened to voters happened via SMS. In the 2018 campaign, that number was 30%. So, significant change in the nature of the data being collected from this kind of engagement. Text messaging is also very clearly reflected here. There are other trends and changes that are generating new data, but don't yet fully appear in these numbers. There are more campaigns reaching out and engaging with voters more significantly online than in the past. And we'll talk a bit more in a minute about some of the other big trends that are changing the nature of the data being generated by campaigns. But one of the results of this was that significantly more data has come in between 2012 through 2016 and into 2018. That data has come in a lot of different shapes and forms. And the technological infrastructure that was built to allow a lot of this analytics to happen, that facilitated a lot of the predictive analytics revolution in campaigns in 2012, by 2018 was fundamentally hamstringing the work of the party to actually conduct meaningful analytics work. Specifically, Vertica continued to be the tool that we use to store and display voter file data in a data warehouse. It was absorbing significantly more data from more external sources, and political analytics has boomed as an industry over this period of time meaning we've had a significant rise in the number of people using and engaging with Vertica and with democratic data directly in this system. So one of the things that meant was that by 2016, Vertica, which had been really revolutionary in 2012, was a system that was largely band-aided together and being held up and just kept barely alive by a group of very dedicated engineers. And we were in a world where a new analyst, learning SQL for the first time, interacting with Vertica, and writing a single bad query could topple the entire system over for every user on the campaign. The only tiny silver lining of this was that we were, during the Clinton campaign in 2016, as analysts working approximately 20-hour days for 7 days a week for months on end. So occasionally, Vertica toppling for several hours was the only kind of break that we actually got during the day. Not a great silver lining, but something. So fundamentally, the tech infrastructure has not held up to the kinds of data being generated and the kind of work being done within the industry. That means that right now, as we assess the current role of data in politics, we need to think not only about the data we're gathering and how we're harnessing it to run more effective, efficient programs, but we also need to think about how we're building technological infrastructure that makes it possible to collect and deploy that data at scale. This is about not only making sure that as campaign programs change, we're capturing the data so that we know what's happening, but it's also about connecting, identifying opportunities for integration within that data, so data can proactively lead changes in campaign strategy, identify new areas for integration, and identify new ways to reach and engage with voters. So I want to talk about what that looks like and questions we're evaluating in the role of data in campaigns today in 3 broad categories. First, when we think about targeting voters and running efficient programs, we need to make sure we're collecting the data we need to identify who those target voters are, who the people are who are most likely to be moved by engagement with political campaigns, and we are collecting the data we need to be able to reach them somewhere through an effective mechanism that will engage them and move them to take action. Second, we need to make sure we're not just identifying some people who will respond to campaign messaging, but are effectively collecting the data that we need to effectively model the behavior of the entire electorate and understand likely outcomes. That's critical for making sure, in the context of, for instance, the upcoming presidential campaign, we're able to identify where we need to invest resources and where they will have the highest effect at tipping the outcome of the Electoral College. And then finally, we need to make sure we're creating infrastructure that supports these changes, collects the data that's available to us now, and is not just designed to handle today's data, but is able to evolve as the data available to campaigns is continually shifting. So, concretely, what does this mean? When we look at being able to identify target voters and reach them effectively, we just talked about how the activity of political campaigns has expanded significantly in 2016 and 2018. We're producing a significantly higher volume of outreach to voters than we were before. But we're also running into some roadblocks. Specifically, the ways that voters are engaging with political campaigns is changing in ways that are making traditional forms of outreach less effective. Specifically, if you look at how likely a voter is to answer the phone when a political campaign calls them, that number has been cut in half between 2010 and 2018. Voters are significantly less likely to answer when they're called. They're also less likely to answer a knock on their door or in other ways engage with traditional campaign outreach. This is a problem because it makes voters on the whole harder to reach, but also because these effects are not distributed uniformly across all of the people that campaigns are trying to target. Specifically, well, the contact rates are falling across the board. Specific target audiences are especially being left behind. In 2018, for instance, a voter under 40 was half as likely to answer a phone call as a voter over 70. What that means is that, well, approximately 29% of all of the people that campaigns tried to call during 2018 were under 40. Only around 19% of the people that we actually reached were. And conversely, well, approximately 19% of the people we tried to reach were over the age of 70. Those people represented closer to 30% of all campaign contacts. So that means that we know that there are particular groups of people, especially groups like younger voters, that we know are especially important targets for campaigns to reach and mobilize to vote, that are uniquely hard to reach through traditional outreach. The silver lining here is that there are a whole host of new technologies coming into the space that are designed to provide a plethora of new ways to engage with voters. Significant rise in new tactics that open up new opportunities for us to talk to people. Text messages is one great example of this that's risen to really huge proportion in the last few election cycles. But over the last few years, campaigns have also tested technology that interacts with voters through chatbots embedded in social media pages, other direct forms of direct social media engagement, and some low-tech tools. We've seen a rise in people in campaigns using postcard programs to write to voters direct handwritten messages between volunteers and voters, talking to them about their concerns. We've also seen a particular rise in technology that's designed to tap into the individual relationships between campaign volunteers and activists and people that they already know and have relationships with, who can be moved and mobilized by hearing from a trusted messenger. But we know that fully measuring the effect of relational organizing requires a new form of data capture. Understanding how social networks actually map to moving people to vote and what messengers are most effective over time at mobilizing people they know to turn out. A number of these new tools and tactics have been fundamentally grounded in engaging with voters online. And in many ways, this is changing not just the face of campaign organizing, but also of the data that is being collected. Well, campaigns had classically engaged with voters in a way that was fundamentally built around the voter file, around defining a list of voters to start with, calling those people, directly tracking those one-on-one engagements. There are new challenges specifically when we know that social media is the first place that many voters are ever going to interact with a campaign. That will have interaction points there that aren't directly mapped back to individual behaviors we can track on a voter file. And it raises both new opportunities but also new challenges in our ability to track the effectiveness of programs when we've traditionally been able to measure whether a program works based on an individual record in the voter file, which ultimately comes back with a record of whether or not that person turned out in the election that we were running program around. When we start to think about measuring online engagement in a really serious way, we need to start moving beyond that voter file contained view of people to understand more holistically how people are interacting in the world, whether or not we're able to map them directly back to a human on the voter file in that foundation of democratic data. This starts with understanding how are we as campaigns engaging with voters online. How are people engaging with our websites and social media activities? What things are they responding positively or negatively to? But fundamentally, a truly 360-degree view of voters requires not just understanding our own interactions with with voters online, but also understanding how voters are being affected by discussion, by other targeted messaging that happens on the internet. One starting point of that is that we're working within the Democratic Party to build a data exchange that will allow us to track in real time information about not just how our campaigns are talking to voters, but how organizations across the progressive world are talking to voters online and offline. This is actually an idea borrowed from the Republican Party, which exchanges data through a trust to track information about how every different organization within the Republican ecosystem is having conversations with the same voters. Mirroring this idea on the Democratic side gives us an opportunity to both understand a more holistic picture of how voters are engaging with campaigns, but also to solve for inefficiencies, where campaigns are inundating the same voters with the same message, or are learning the same lessons in separate ways about what voters are and aren't responding effectively to. But we also know that we're at a moment where trust in political organizations as messengers is at an all-time low. So the answer can't just be understanding how people are hearing information from us as political organizations. It also means things like understanding what the organic conversation is that voters are having online, how they're talking about political issues in public online forums like Twitter, how they're behaving, the issues that are moving them, and that are moving them either positively or negatively to care about a political candidate. Beyond that, part of this is also understanding and taking seriously the political reality that political organizations working for candidates are not the only organizations that are targeting voters online with political messaging, but we also have to be aware of the role that malicious actors play in seeking to actively confuse or fuel distrust among voters. We know that in 2016, this kind of activity on social media played a serious role in sowing distrust in the 2016 election. And we know that still today, there are ongoing dedicated efforts by foreign adversaries to disinform voters for the purpose not just in undermining faith in our candidates, but in the political process as a whole. Understanding this and being able to engage with it effectively, it fundamentally requires taking this 360-degree approach to understanding all of the ways that voters are learning information about political candidates online and about parties, how they're talking to others, how they're being talked to by other organizations, so that we can identify both what is effectively moving voters from our side, but also where there's specific threats of disinformation that voters are being influenced by that we need to be able to target and combat. So all of these factors are relevant to understanding who we need to be targeting, what kind of program we should be targeting at them in order to reach and effectively move those people to take action, and where we need to engage to combat things that are happening online that are influencing voters negatively. But all of these changes in how voters engage with campaigns also has implications for our ability to understand the behaviors of the electorate as a whole. Specifically, we talked earlier about the importance of being able to model the behavior of the entire electorate in order to understand what states are going to have close elections, where we can effectively allocate resources. But as contact rates decline, as people pick up the doors and phones less often, our ability to do those things in particular is being challenged. Political polling has historically relied on primarily phone calls to voters, and until relatively recently has relied on phone calls to voters with landlines to have conversations about their political beliefs. As phone contact rates have declined, and as we talked about, have declined unevenly across different groups in the population, we know that the people who are answering their phone and engaging in 15-minute conversations with pollsters are probably not representative of the electorate overall. We know especially that it is uniquely hard to get responses from certain segments of the population, which means it's easy to underrepresent certain groups in political polling, or to have to upweight the responses of a small number of respondents and make a small sample speak for the beliefs or behaviors of an entire population in ways that can be dangerous and misleading. In the last few years, there's been a concerted effort to combat this problem, with a rise in new ways to poll and understand the opinions of voters, including through polling on things like online forums. These do, though, carry their own risk. Part of the reason that polling has traditionally happened through phone calls is because it gave us a very easy framework for saying we will take a list of people from the voter file, we will build a sample that reflects what the electorate is going to look like, and we can confirm when we're talking to somebody that it's actually the voter we believed it to be using a combination of phone number and demographic data. When polling expands online, we risk losing that opportunity and facing challenges with our ability to match the responses being collected online to an individual voter record, which means there are new risks that we're building samples of voters that are not in fact representative of the population overall. Finally, we know that beyond just polling online, there's a significant rise in just the data available as people are talking in online public forums about their political beliefs and opinions. And we should be able to capture and harness this data to understand people's preferences for political candidates or their concerns about specific political issues. But we also know that among all of the information being generated through conversation online, it's going to be a challenge to effectively separate the signal from the noise in a way that can give us meaningful predictive information about elections. One specific example of this comes from an article that was in the New York Times in the Upshot earlier this week that looked at the differences between people, between Democrats especially, who post on social media and those that don't. Their research found that Democrats who post political content online are more likely than the Democratic electorate overall to be highly educated, to have college degrees, to be white, and to donate to political organizations, among a host of other differences. What that means is that we have to be very attentive and aware of the fact that we can't just model or take for granted that information being generated online is meaningfully reflective of the things that people care about or the issues that matter to voters. So, across all of these problems, we have both new sources of data that give us new opportunities to learn more about who we should talk to, about what's going to happen in elections, and about the effective ways to run a program that reaches voters around the country. But we also know that we need to build a system that effectively utilizes this data, that understands what's working and what's not, and that is able to track new sources of data as they come in. So again, that starts with expanding our core set of data about voters beyond just the voter file to a 360-degree view of how voters are engaging with campaigns, with each other, and with other organizations. It means routinely incorporating new data sources. These are just a handful of companies that have come into existence just over the last 4 years that are generating data in new structures and forms, some on an individual level that we can match back to records on the voter file, some in aggregate and in other forms, but that give us new opportunities to learn what's working and what's not in political data, but require building a flexible, adaptable data model that both incorporates these sources of information and the new ones that we know are likely to arise over the next 2 years and beyond. Finally, it requires moving away from technology that's going to fall over whenever a new person starts learning how to interact with data in it. So that's meant in 2019, as we prepare for 2020, we are retiring Vertica as the backbone of this entire infrastructure. We're moving to a data warehouse built on Google BigQuery so that fundamentally people can interact with all of this data without risking knocking the entire system over, to provide both a secure and stable foundation for analysts and data scientists, and to provide a foundation that people can build on top of and can do new innovative work that pushes the bounds of political data forward and drives political strategy as a result. So, we're facing a lot of both challenges and opportunities as the data available to campaigns shifts and provides new opportunities for how we use that data to engage with voters. I know there are things that are unique to that data in the political world, but there are also a lot of these challenges that aren't unique. The challenges of data integration, standardization, and effective utilization is something that exists across industries, and so I'm really excited to be here with all of you talking about and learning from the challenges that we've all worked with to make politics even better in how we utilize data to advance our strategic goals. Thank you.
Voter behavior
Yeah.
to vote for a candidate. What about the flip side of that, to influence and impact voter behavior to build resentment against a character or against voting at all?
Yeah, well, so I know I'll flip back a couple of slides. We know that there are organizations that are explicitly trying to do this. These are all actual examples of social media posts explicitly designed to provide false information to voters, give people to suggest to voters, for instance, that they can vote online by tweeting their votes and they don't need to bother showing up. To sow distrust among, for instance, we know that this was a thing that was used to sow distrust among Democrats after the primary ended in 2016, and sow divisiveness between people who had supported two different candidates during the primary. It's absolutely a risk. We absolutely think it's affecting voter behavior. Our goal as the Democratic Party is to make voting accessible, to engage people and turn them out to vote. So explicitly discouraging behavior or sowing that distrust is the thing that we're fundamentally trying to combat. But we know that it's a risk, and we know that being able to collect the data on when that's happening, who's being targeted by it, and who it is effectively influencing is critical to our ability to actually combat that sort of challenge.
You said that you have campaigns to influence voters. Do you have any such campaigns to attract more volunteers? Do you do any kind of exercise to encourage more people to sign up as volunteers?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question was, what do we do to attract more people to volunteer? So I talked a little bit about the data that campaign field programs are collecting from doors that are knocked and phone calls that are made. That the same CRM that we use to track engagement with voters is also used to track engagement between activists and volunteers with campaigns, which means we've also developed a robust, more than a decade-long system of record keeping of everybody who shows up and volunteers, comes to an event in support of a campaign. So we just talked about a couple of the predictive models that campaigns build in order to target voters, identifying support and turnout. We also do things like specifically modeling propensity to volunteer, to understand the traits that make somebody likely to be an activist with a campaign, and we make that available to organizations all over the country. It's been especially interesting over the last 2 years as there's been a massive spike in engagement with Democratic campaigns after the 2016 election, a massive rise in volunteerism, and that's provided a new wealth of data that helps us identify people who are now engaging in the political process as activists and volunteers, but hadn't historically, but harnessing that data to help future campaigns is definitely one of our focuses.